Hello, hello. Welcome to our panel discussion, The Future of Monuments. My name is Ebony Dumas. I'm the Director of Planning and Engagement at Forecast Public Art, and thank you so much for being here with us today. Today's discussion is one of our public programs that connects people more deeply to each issue of our digital publication, Forward. The Monuments and Memorials issue of Forward is free and available on our website. You'll find the link in the chat in just a moment. This issue of Forward was produced in partnership with the new Monuments Task Force, who you'll also hear from very shortly. Next slide, please. This event is hosted by Forecast Public Art. We are a nonprofit organization with a 46-year history working to support artists and public spaces. We have a mission to activate, inspire, and advocate for public art that advances justice, health, and human dignity. Next slide, please. Forecast Home Office resides on land cared for and called home by the Dakota, Sioux, and Ojibwe people and other Native peoples from time immemorial and the geopolitical boundaries of St. Paul, Minnesota. Our work also takes place in cities, counties, neighborhoods, and tribal communities across the country. Next, please. Our team is made up of practicing artists, facilitators, urban planners, architects, curators, and trainers, all who are actively working on 20 to 30 projects here and around the country at any given time. Next, please. In our creative studio, we connect people with public artists and placemakers through equitable processes while developing and providing resources for public artists with an emphasis on Black, Indigenous, and artists of color. Our planning and engagement work provides consultation, strategy, and technical assistance to partners, decision makers, and stakeholders in public art, creative placemaking, and place-based design to help with long-term arts and cultural planning and community engagement activities. Next, please. In our Learning Institute, we provide in-person and online learning opportunities for public artists, decision makers, and partners who are facilitating public art and placemaking projects and/or working with public artists. Through our Change Lab, we are focused on addressing equity gaps in the fields of public art and placemaking and researching and developing new methods of practice in these fields across the United States. We hire research fellows to investigate the public art policies, processes, and programs that exist in the US and make recommendations oriented in justice and human dignity. And most relevant to today's discussion, we share important stories through publications and events in our Forward publication and panel series. Next, please. So before today's panel begins, we'll first hear briefly from Claire Flanagan, the guest editor of the newest issue of Forward. Claire is an architectural and urban historian who is passionate about using her public history background to interrogate public spaces and how they represent the communities around them. Her work in the new Monuments Task Force allows her to use historical research to create cultural power and uplift stories that have been historically ignored. And so finally, one more time, I want to say thank you to everyone who's joining us today. Thank you to the panelists. And at this point, I will hand it over to Claire.
Thanks, Ebony. Hi, everybody. My name is Claire Flanagan, like Ebony just said, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what New Monuments Task Force is. I've been working with them for, about 2-3 years now. And New Monuments Task Force is a fantastical municipal agency started in 2020 by Cheyenne Concepcion, who contributed the featured essay in this publication. In collaboration with other artists, preservationists, and community advocates, including Annalisa Escobedo, who curated the Public Art Now section of this publication as well. So the slide up right now is one of the sections of case studies that we chose to be in this publication. And we had a process that involved sort of putting every project that we thought would be good into a Excel sheet. It's about 100 different projects. And so we tried to whittle down that as much as we could. And we turned to the guidelines that New Monuments had established back in 2020 after the monumental reckoning that happened after the murder of George Floyd and the many monuments that were defaced, destroyed, torn down, and just the general awakening of folks to the fact that monuments could in fact represent their communities and were not just simply public art that was meant to represent the victors. So we had 6 guidelines, and those were that new monuments must expand public knowledge, not be on the side of oppression, disrupt old ideas of what monuments can be. They must be dynamic, tell stories on a community level, and challenge observers to stop and think twice. So once we applied these guidelines to our very long list, we began to frame the 4 sections of the publication around different shifts that we saw in the world of public art and the way that artists were thinking and speaking about new monuments. So the 4 shifts that we identified were reinterpreting sites, as you see here, which was a shift that artists, in the way that artists are using the history of a place to inform and inspire their artwork, and to really emphasize inhabiting space in order to engage with past events. Next slide, please. And then we chose narrative shifts to highlight a change in whose stories are being told, as new voices are being centered in public art and in monuments and memorials. And while working on this section, we were inspired to feature exclusively women, non-binary, trans, and gender expansive artists in every study, case study category. Next slide, please. And our third section was public participation. And we saw this as a way that artists are shifting how monuments and memorials are experienced by the viewer. So in this category, we highlighted projects that invited onlookers to become participants in the work through creation or activation of the monument, and not just passive observers. Next slide. And finally, we chose new aesthetics to be our final section, to highlight the change in how monuments look and how artists are telling new and different stories by being able to pair a monument's meaning with a wider array of materials, presentations, and just aesthetics in general to grab the viewer's attention and challenge what a monument is allowed to look like. So overall, we wanted the reader to come away with ideas on how to advocate for their communities with public art as the medium, and to really understand how vital artists are in building a more equitable world.
Thanks, Claire, for getting us grounded in this really beautiful issue. This is me. I'm the Curator of Partnerships and Programming for Forward, Mallory, Rukhsana, Nezam. I also work on the editorial team, and I have the pleasure of guiding our conversation today with our panelists, which include Bethel here, who is, Bethel, if you want to wave and let folks know who you are, is a design director at Mass Design, and Bethel works with many teams all around the country and leads a lot of the monuments and memorials work at Mass Design, including most recently work in Kigali, which includes a museum dedicated to honoring and celebrating Rwanda's national heroes. And Bethel will speak more about the work that she's been doing on our panel today. So welcome, Bethel. We also have Darion, who is the Assistant Director at the Office of Arts and Culture in the city of Portland, Oregon. Darion leads a lot of the work around monuments and memorials in Portland, including some really important work last week, which I'm sure that we will dig into a lot more, and has done some really incredible work around codifying monuments within the city, thinking about policy, thinking about the role of his department and the role of cities broadly in memorials work. And then we have Macy, who's joining us from the Toronto area, and Macy's an artist. foresight strategist, multi-hyphenate practitioner, and also is a licensed IP lawyer. And Macy's work is featured in our issue of Forward. And we can drop a link into that work that Macy did in the Toronto area, and we'll dig in more to that project in our conversation today. So welcome to our panelists. I'm going to stop sharing so that we can see your beautiful faces. And I'm going to go ahead and we're going to get our conversation started. But as we talk today, I'm sure folks will have questions. We want to hear your questions. We're going to do a little panel conversation. Then we'll come to a Q&A at the end. And there is a little Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you've never done it before, just look at the bottom panel. It should say Q&A. And go ahead and submit your questions there so that we can get to those as we move through. So I'm gonna go through a round of questions, one for each of our panelists, and then we'll do some group questions. And the first question I have is for Darion. And Darion, so in recent years, the city of Portland, which is where you live and work, has had a lot of activity around monuments and memorials, which include, like in many cities and towns, removal of monuments, lots of community conversations about how to reframe the monuments that exist. There was also a new city ordinance in Portland that created a process for residents to submit complaints around monuments, a lot of organizing with city council. And then last week, you held a citywide monuments project symposium. So you have been working really deeply in the work of at one city and even inside of government in the role that you hold. So can you share a bit about how policy impacts and interacts with the monuments and memorials in our communities? We're curious what policy can do, what it can't do, and how can it help advance the conversation and action around monuments and memorials?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Mallory, and thank you, Forecast, for inviting us, the city, to be a part of this conversation. I might start the answer maybe with the second part, with the what can policy do, to kind of answer their first question. And part of that is, policy can shift and change the way we do things as a city, and how we look at doing business as normal. For our city, we really didn't have a policy around monuments so clearly around removal, or, for folks to know if there was an issue, how they could reach out to the city. Previously, there was a sole source contract that the city had with a public contractor on art, and the process was a piece of art needed to be up for 10 years in the public. And we've heard from community members that wasn't really sufficient for folks, especially if something didn't reflect their values. So we needed a way to actually define monuments, and that's what the policy did in Portland. Was three things. It first defined monuments in our city as three-dimensional works of art, sculptures that are in public display, used to memorialize or honor a person, place, or event. And we needed to do that because we have separate conversations around memorials that are also happening, and murals. And we're really wanting to focus on what our inflection point here, which were those monuments in 2020 that came down in the city of Portland, and folks wanting to see a response in terms of getting them back up or taking action to move things forward. The policy we created also created identified criteria for the public to be able to submit a complaint to the city. And then based on that criteria, it identified a process for the city to review criteria and then make actions based upon that. We started to test out this policy and this process this year. We released a web report on the city's website. I saw there was a link in the chat, which details the city's work over the last 4 years, which, there's been a lot of different projects that have happened and connected the monuments, but we really haven't had a focused effort to do this. Having this policy really allows us to maximize on opportunities like the Mellon Foundation grant, which is really around public engagement and learning and hearing from the community about what monuments mean to them. And being a part of this process, we've really tried to shift the dialogue from being about those physical sculptures to really be more expansive about what Portlanders' values are and the things that connect us in our city. We have a unique thing in Portland where our monuments that were toppled were the unique ones that are the reflection point for us are three presidents who were the presidents of the country in a way that we want to interrogate, the history and the complexities that exist with our presidents, but we don't want to necessarily, say they didn't exist. We also have some monuments that were really, many Portlanders have said to us, don't reflect current day values of the city. Those include a monument of Promised Land, which was the pioneer family, and a monument of Harvey Scott, who was a Oregonian editor that said a lot of misogynistic and racist things in the past that we don't think should be, signified in the public as our current day values. And the policy that we have allows us to look at a process with the public about how do we resolve those issues. At our symposium, we worked with our local university, Portland State University's Institute for Data and Research, to help refine the questions that the city was asking so that we can hear from Portlanders about these monuments. So, for example, our question is, the city of Portland has decisions to make about public art. These decisions include about our history and how to educate the public about our monuments. What principles and practices should guide those decisions? Those are the kinds of questions that we're asking through this policy and process that we created earlier this year. We're going to be developing and refining it over the next year. I know, my charge will really be standing up that complaint process for folks to be able to officially submit a process to the city. And that'll look different as we test things out. This policy we created also allows us, the opportunity to work at a pace that is reflective of the community and not in a way to just move things forward. So I hopefully think I might have answered some of your question. If you need me to follow up, I'm happy to add any more on top of that.
That's great, Darion. I think you've got me thinking about so Forward typically tries to facilitate cross-sector conversations. This is one of them. So, and we know that with monuments and memorials, it's, artists are central to this conversation. And there are also so many other collaborators, like you're working with your colleagues across the city, you're working on policy, you're working with community. Claire is a historian here, we've got an architect, we've got a lawyer. So this really does take, I think, all of these different professionals and community members coming together to make this work. And I also find monuments and memorials interesting because there isn't much of a roadmap, I think, for folks who are in the kind of role that you're in, Darion, with the city. I think there are other public art administrators or arts administrators, a lot of them that work with forecasts or come to these kinds of events that are also trying to figure out how in their roles, with their arts departments or with the city, what their role is, in the posts similar to yours. So I think you're a great model for how to actually move the conversation forward, bring community in, and resolve some of these issues in the capacity that you can, right? Like from your perch. So thanks for sharing that particular perspective. Macy, I want to shift to you because you enter this from a different angle. You have a different kind of role within this ecosystem. And so your collective project called Memory Work, which is a futuristic mural presented under a freeway in Toronto. And it's a monument to the future of Toronto, which is an interesting way to think about monuments, right? Future and past. It's also featured in the Forward issue, which we'll make sure we have links in the chat. So I'm curious if you can talk about, this is such a dynamic project that you all have created. It's a mural, but it also was intensively researched. It has photography elements, costuming, sound art, and more. You were just sharing about textile components. So can you share a bit more about what it means to kind of be thinking about material and aesthetic in a really different way, especially as you think about a monument to the future? We so often talk about monuments to the past. So can you share a bit about the materiality and also kind of that future thinking?
Yeah, of course. Thanks again for the invitation. So before jumping into the work itself, I just want to give a little bit of context to From Later, which is a foresight studio, little foresight studio based in Toronto here. So our practice generally involves producing what we've come to call research platforms, which are essentially foresight studies that make the foundation and an invitation for many more expressions from artists or writers or other types of practitioners. And our practice is really about thinking through kind of like an intimate braiding of futures research and artistic practice. So for us, we really want to leverage like the forms, practices, and conventions of the arts, because as we all know, there is a timelessness to certain, narrative forms, song structures, etc., and allow those to become a kind of scaffolding and a technique for us to shape the imaginary. And the other thing that's also really important to us is to be really critical of futures work and innovation and new technology in general. I think oftentimes there is a preoccupation to kind of only look forward, and there's a neglect to include memory, as though we can just kind of arrive in a future place with like no baggage, no trauma, no sense of the past. So of course, we all have our histories. We all have our personal and cultural memory. So the connotations and what we like to focus on in terms of what we call future feeling, and how can we render that? How can we allow people, the public, to be immersed in that, is a lot of what we think about in our creative practice. So when we are imagining future potential, we attend to this. We think about how memory is constructed, how it's encapsulated, how it's told, and especially how it's felt. And so that is really at the core of the memory work project, and also hence the name, in terms of doing the work to remember and potentially retell and engage with the past, present, and future. I would definitely love to emphasize that memory work is definitely a collective futures project. It involved a lot of different local artists, local community members, and it's kind of spawned into a continuous program of workshops, speculative audio works, world building in general, durational performances, and the public monument, and what we call the Memory Work Collective. And the project reimagines features of Toronto that really tries to prioritize values of collective care and a politics that value nurturing over growth. So in memory work, we kind of time travel to a future. It's not necessarily a utopian future per se. We try to focus on tensions that provokes conversations for us to be critical about what our city's future could be. And so we time travel to a future, and we go even further to wonder how that future could be remembered. And then the physical manifestation of that is this, what we're calling, it's made into a monument as a way to think about that further future, and to contemplate the potential leaders or figures that would be remembered in that future. And of course, it's placed here in our present day in a special site to our local community here, where it becomes, like you said, a monument to a future. So there is this interweaving of time that straddles the past, future, and the present. It is what we call kind of a portal that sits at a site of the Bentway, which you alluded to. It's a repurposed public space that sits below the Gardiner Expressway, which is a highway that runs across the entire city, and it mirrors a waterfront shoreline, and it has a lot of rich Indigenous history in terms of its significance to Indigenous communities in the past, both in terms of nature and resources that it brings, and also with Indigenous community lives. And it's also a really heavy traffic public space that invites us in our everyday life to relate to our ancestors and our descendants, and really demands us to wonder about our own responsibility in our future. And in the work, there is, like you were saying, there's a pattern of research as well as imagination that runs through time to create all the different manifestations of the work. So the research itself, which was led by us from later. It really stemmed from a lot of conversations that we had with women leaders in our local community, to bring in their own histories, as well as the way that they're shaping their current practice. What are the questions that they're asking about what is changing in their realm of expertise, their general preoccupations in their everyday life, and their concerns with our world today, to create the basis of the characters that were developed as part of this work, and made into an audio soundscape. That was kind of the first instance of the work, is that the research that was done, and then a world that was created through an audio soundscape. And then this was later morphed into a physical manifestation of this speculative future in the present day site at the Bentway. And yeah, again, like, it's a rich site with a lot of Indigenous history, and that is also now, you know, being very much intentionally activated in the present day as part of the Bentway. And in the monument, you will see the people who sat for the photographs. They are themselves some of the people that we spoke to that informed the research, and they are the present day leaders in their communities in Toronto. So they're working in related fields to the ones of the characters that they're representing. So, for example, there's a character called Dom. They are a rewilder character who, you know, designs new forms of living infrastructure in the memory world. And it's played by a real person and living today, called Cheyenne Sundance, who founded a year-round urban farm in Toronto, which values education around soil health, fair labor wages, community building, and knowledge sharing among BIPOC farmers. So that's just like one example. And then we worked with a local artist called Raji Pereira. So she did a beautiful painted layer of embellishment on the photographs, which kind of mimics this a similar way in terms of how we do world building. So building from research signals of change, ideas, hopes, desires, from either secondary research or, you know, primary research from the people that we've talked to, and things that we're feeling or hearing among the community today. And then so there's kind of this process of like elaborating, exaggerating, and extrapolating future possibilities, but layering them onto present day. The other thing is this whole project in all of its instantiations, it spun out this collective that is independent from later, and it has organically become self-sustaining in a way. So we're seeing different artists using the research or being inspired by what they've seen and creating their own works. So it's been really interesting to observe that, as well as sometimes be involved in that process as well. So ultimately, yeah, memory work is intended to be an exploratory platform, and just like the beginning of possible stories for others to continue expressions of it. And for us, the key is really that it invites participation. So it's meant to be a resource to question and iterate on. And so it's been really interesting to see how others have built out this world in their own practice. And the monument is, of course, also a deliberate choice of medium. Obviously, there has been, you know, a lot of great controversy over monuments in recent years. We're questioning and we're angry about what and who we're commemorating. But meanwhile, we kind of seem to say that we really don't know or can't agree on how to construct a collective memory. And that's kind of the practice that we're trying to do with the Memory Work Collective. So sometimes we tend to be able to agree on what we don't want necessarily to be in our cultural memory, but sometimes we don't know yet what to replace it with. So with memory work, our hope is that, you know, as a monument to a future Toronto, we're asking the public to engage with a changing city and to really question what is their relationship to it, and how we might see ourselves creating different futures for the city. Yeah.
I always smile a lot as I engage with this particular work. There's a playfulness and imaginativeness and almost a joy in it that is really just beautiful work. I also think it's an interesting application of the power to see how artists actually lead this kind of rethinking of monuments and where you all took it, and the like future visioning that you were able to do. I think practicing that future is a really beautiful thing that artists help us do in all different contexts, and absolutely with monuments and memorials. We're going to shift over to Bethel, who's coming to us from Mass Design's Public Memory and Memorials Lab. And we know that in your role with the lab, that you've worked to create a lot of different monuments, including the Embrace by Hank Willis Thomas, which is in Boston. It's the piece that depicts MLK and Coretta Scott King. The Gun Violence Memorial Project, which we've actually featured in a forward issue on community safety, also beautiful work. The National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama, which I'm sure many of you know, among many, many others. And I'm hoping that you can share a little bit more about what it takes to develop partnerships, because as I think all of our panelists have described, lots of partners are coming together to make this happen. So can you share a bit about how you develop partnerships that don't just result in a new sculpture, right, like a piece, but are actually helping to move the needle on underlying issues that a monument or memorial are pointing to? And if you have examples, I would welcome those as well.
Yeah, first I want to say thank you for having me, and it's great to be here and to be in conversation with everyone, so thank you. Partnerships and developing partnerships that result in memorials that move the needle. I think for us, I think it's always started by building off a unified and collective mission, something that gives everyone a North Star for the work that we're embarking on. At Mass, we're probably a bit uniquely positioned as a nonprofit design firm to enter conversations early, to dedicate a bit more time and resources and early visioning conversations with our partners. It helps us cultivate strong relationships that are anchored in the mission of the work we're taking on, and taking the time to not just understand that North Star, but to really question the impact, the larger systemic change we want to see through the work, ask what's really going to help us move that needle. And with that as a foundation in place, as we start to move forward with the work, and circumstances change or new roadblocks arise, as is always inevitable, everyone kind of has that North Star, and the method, the way we go about it may change, but we all know what we're aiming for, and we have those kind of impact metrics and systemic change in mind, as we continue forward. And what that looks like, I guess, specifically around memorialization is different across projects, but within the Public Memory and Memorials Lab at Mass was started after or as we were completing the work on the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama. It's a memorial dedicated to the victims of lynching across the US. And we really carried the lessons we learned. At that point, that was kind of the largest and longest running memorial project we had. And we learned a lot from the Equal Justice Initiative, who was leading that work. And we carried that all of those lessons into the work that followed and the work we do today. And primarily, I think from the beginning, the Equal Justice Initiative was very clear about the impact they wanted to have with this memorial. They were a group of lawyers that were providing legal services to people on death row, predominantly Black men, some of whom were wrongfully convicted or given incredibly harsh sentences. And they realized that in order to better defend their clients, they had to step outside the courtroom to think about the history, the narratives, the systems that led to this current state of mass incarceration. So that they needed to work in, they understood that they needed to work in social spaces to change the narrative, to break the silence on histories that we didn't talk about. And because they understood that by not talking about and addressing these histories, we're not moving us forward, but instead helping us perpetuate the harmful systems that resulted in them. The space that they needed and the memorial that resulted from that mission and impact that they had identified was a space that broke the silence so we can work towards reconciliation and healing. It wasn't just a monument that you encounter, but more of an experience that takes visitors on a journey that evokes and provokes dialogue and gets at the heart of truth-telling and reconciliation and narrative shifts. And as all the circumstances changed as we designed and implemented that project, I think that was always true. And the form of it and the experience that resulted in it was kind of a given from the start. So yeah, I think that's one example. It's the first example that comes to mind as we think of building partnerships and ensuring that the projects that result from them are kind of like mission centered and aligned.
Mm-hmm. So I'm hearing really getting everyone who wants to be a part of this to coalesce around a North Star that almost serves like a mission for the undertaking, and that a lot of things will, I think, move, it sounds like, in that direction. I've yet to go to the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, and I live so close now. I just moved to Atlanta. I'm nearby. I need to make the journey. Well, thank you all for sharing more about your work individually. I want to bring the three of you together to talk to each other. So the first thing that I want to ask y'all about, I think I'm actually going to go to the second question I've drafted here, which is really thinking about the role that artists are playing specifically in monuments and memorials work. What do you all think the role of the artist is in the current day where this conversation, where the work is?
I could start. I don't want to say I would say I think this is necessarily the role of artists, but how I've seen artists show up in this space is really like leading a lot of these dialogues and conversations. At our symposium, we had about 9 artists who spoke on the second day to talk about the specific work that they're doing around monuments. Some of those are, live in its performance. Some of them are conversations. And something that Mindy, you said earlier, or Macy, sorry, that reminded me about this dialogue of like exploration in these conversations and really the baggage that we can't leave behind. And one of the artists who came to our talks was Gerald Clark, who's an Indigenous artist, and he spoke on the first day around this work he's doing called To the Next Generation, where he's created fake monuments of historical markers that, provoke conversations, and they cause folks to, I think differently about, what is history and what are these things that we believe to be facts. And so I would just, really just host in that the artists are, from my perspective in this moment, really leading a lot of the dialogue and we're trying to keep up.
Yeah, just jumping off of that, there's like this quote from Ezra Pound that's kind of like always resonated with our practice, where they say artists are humanity's antenna. So art has a way of presenting life to itself, and in this way it demands anticipation of what's unfolding, what's changing in the world in the present, and then also like what's emerging like towards certain futures. So again, echoing what Darion was saying, I think through art, there's like a means to free ourselves from certain forms and to kind of embrace being a little bit absurd, and to have the permission to be use art, like embrace the value of kind of quote unquote uselessness in art, as opposed to, you know, the need for functional practicality, usefulness in design, for example. But I think art allows us to diverge. So it allows us to perceive or conceive in new ways. It allows us to ask, you know, what is it that we desire, or that we want to strive for, and why, and also like push us into discomfort in a way to warn us of, you know, maybe certain change is uncomfortable, and why is that, and what do we want to do about it, to have these, you know, new unfelt thoughts that we can reflect on and be critical about. So I think there's kind of this divergence that's really freeing, but then at the same time it's also allowing us to converge as well. So I always kind of think of art also to being able to be like, art is also strategy. It opens up space to converge, converge after the divergence to allow us to take potential action. So yeah, it's just my little thought there.
Yeah, I guess I'd add on to that. I think, I mean, artists have the capacity for, you know, creativity and imagination to really like spatialize and visualize memory. They have a kind of cultural competence and the ability to like embed history and storytelling in space, or to make it visible, and that allows us all to experience it. We worked with Hank Willis Thomas on the Embrace in Boston, which is one of the projects you mentioned earlier, Mallory. And it's a sculpture dedicated to Dr. King and Coretta Scott King, and it's a piece about their love, not necessarily just for each other, but, you know, the love they had for humanity. And Hank, when thinking about the memorial to them, was inspired by a photo of them embracing. They were hugging. I think it was right after the announcement for that Dr. King was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And when Hank explains his work in general, he talks about wanting to bring out or making evident to people the things that they may have missed or not seen. And to him, in that photo, it looked like Coretta Scott King was holding up and supporting Dr. King, and that exemplified the love that they showed the world. And Hank transforms that idea into physical form that we can all experience. When you go to visit the monument now, it's hard to not experience that embracing support. And I think art is one of the few mediums that allows us all to see and experience and feel stories in that way.
That makes me think, Macy, about, you were talking about with your work, valuing collective care, nurturing overgrowth, and to be able to see that actually spatialized Bethel in Boston, the way that Coretta supported MLK, a theme I noticed. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I would love to hear what other questions our audience members have. Please use the Q&A function. That would be great. Please send us some questions. So we're going to go to one more of mine, and then we'll move to your questions. So this one is going to be interesting. That the 5 stages of grief is going to frame this question. So the 5 stages of grief are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. And the reason I'm using those is because our lead essayist in the forward issue likens some of the experience of the monuments and memorials movement and the processes that it's undergone as moving through these stages of grief. So I'm curious, does this process or these stages resonate at all with you? Have you witnessed this kind of denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, grief cycle at all in the kind of memory work that you all have led?
I'll jump off since I'm already unmuted. I think these stages happen over time, and I was thinking about this as I was reading the essay, and the kind of the evolution of the memorial landscape as a whole, as we've seen these stages play out over the last few years. But then I started thinking more like at a singular memorial scale. For me, the project that kind of comes to mind immediately is the Gun Violence Memorial Project that we worked on, which kind of deals with grief very directly and more with individuals. For those that don't know, the Gun Violence Memorial Project is a memorial to the victims of gun violence. It is, we have invited families that have lost loved ones to gun violence to donate an object of their loved one to be encased in a glass brick. And then we have 700 of these glass bricks that make up a house. 700 was at the time the number of gun violence victims a week in the US. That was in 2018 when we started the project. And there are 4 houses, and 4 houses kind of represent a month of gun violence victims, but the houses really just create a framework for families to collectively create a memorial to their loved ones. And the stages of grief play out through the creation of the memorial, through the collection of objects, through the way that people engage with the memorial. But it's really in that final stage of acceptance that families can really contribute to create this memorial. And in turn, you see the memorial supporting families heal and also allowing them a larger platform for conversations around gun violence and gun safety and advocating, and that can lead to like collective action within their communities and beyond. But I think that these stages of grief play out, I think, over the kind of larger landscape, but seeing it play out on a kind of smaller scale within this work has also shown how like memorials can support the healing of that grieving process. And that was kind of what came to mind when I saw that question. And yeah.
I think for me, it's less necessarily the stages, but grief in general, as like you're saying, is a form of memory work. So it's like how we process and carry the weight of something that has been lost or something that is in the past. Because when we grieve, we're like actively engaging with memories. So not really just a person or place or moment that's gone, but also like the relationships, the context, and the histories tied to them. So I think it's not just about contending with like a void from a loss or something that has passed, something that's, in the past, but also more importantly about how we hold, we transform and carry those memories forward, and in that allowing ourselves to shape future possibilities. So I like that kind of likening to the grief process, because I see it as similar to all the examples of the works that have been done as a bridge between past and future, and memory anchors us in reflection while urging us to imagine what can come next. Yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciate the question. And I would say, similarly around this idea of just grief in general and all the stages that come with it, for our project, it's become really clear that monuments are deeply personal to folks for whatever reason. It could be the figure, the place, or it could be your local school that you feel such a deep affinity to folks. And, this process of grief, and I think loss is also something that we've seen a lot, and people wanting to be a little bit more vulnerable. We have concerned Portlanders on both sides of this issue, and for us, there is folks in the community who have shared with me that when they grew up, this narratives around the expansion of America and discovery of the West is much more different than the reality of genocide and the stealing and forceful removal of lands. And so those conversations, I think, for people they're grieving in real time their realities and these monuments and what they mean to them is some of what we've been trying to unpack, as a community, as it's deeply complex. And so thank you for the question.
I love all of that. It's like memory out loud, shared memory. We all have to share these sites, these public sites and public places. And typically memory is so personal, so private, Darion, to your point. But what does it look like when we have collective memory, when there's so much diversity of how we remember what stories we value? And that is the work that you all are doing. I'm going to shift over to some of our audience questions. So please submit more if you have them. This question is pretty practical, tactical, which we always love here at Forward Publication. And it's specifically to you, Macy, but I'm going to kind of open it up to everybody. So this is a question about timeframes for doing the kind of work that you all are doing. So specifically the question is, Macy, curious what the timeframe looked like for the planning of memory work, doing the research, working with collaborators, and actually completing the work. And then I'd open it up also to Darion and Bethel, how you all kind of create timelines to do the work that you do.
Oh, that's hard. I don't think there's ever an end. And I think that's also, how memory work became so many different manifestations. I think partly is maybe just the need to set timelines for yourself. And sometimes that, comes from certain limitations. So for example, if the project is rooted in a grant and you have to finish it within X period of time, that was what happened with some of these manifestations. But yeah, the initial research started as early as late 2019. And then we released the audio soundscape actually during COVID, because it was supposed to be as part of an exhibition. But obviously COVID happened. And then so we released it online in 2020. And then and then we realized that we really wanted to make this a physical public art project. And so it was actually a whole process of research and development, even trying to get a grant, trying to find partners, and then doing more work with different artists, kind of allowing the collective to come together organically. And then the actual work was installed and launched in 2022. And then there has been other kind of activations since then. It was nice to have a physical site to ground ourselves. And so we've run a number of workshops and other things since then. And the work is still up right now at the Bentway. We're so thankful of that partnership there. And it's such an important site. So yeah, the timeline's hard. I think sometimes it's just like research can continue forever. So it might be giving yourself some deadlines, or just saying, what can we bring alive with what we have in this time, and then think about other iterations that can continue the work, and also giving room for the work to grow on its own. I think that was also a little bit of luxury on our side. Just it wasn't something that had hard timelines, so we were able to give it the time. We were able to develop relationships in our community. We were able to develop relationships with artists, a little bit with what Bethel was saying in terms of forming trust with the partners that you have in your projects. A lot of times I think time is a really, really important element in that. So allowing room and space for that to concretize was a little bit of luxury that we had as well. Yeah.
I agree with you. Oh, sorry. Oh, I just wanted to say I agree with you, Macy, is that this work is ongoing. And, I think this work also moves at the speed of trust, which is unique. There's a memory project that started in 2007 at the city to honor Rosa Parks. And it's taken nearly 2 decades for us to complete this work with the community that brought it forward. And this just evolves, I think, depending on what the project is and what you're really trying to do. Our city, said that we wanted to return our beloved elk statue in 2021, and we're still working right now to get it up in the public, mainly because of contracting challenges, availability of resources and processes that aren't necessarily folks slowing it down. It's just there are some additional indicators, but ultimately it seems to be that moving at the speed of trust and knowing that things will take time and sometimes, unfortunately, decades, but hopefully the work does get complete in the end.
We have a new question in the chat, and I want to make sure we make some time for that. So I'm gonna just pop in, and this is from Isabella. So Isabella asks, for all of your work, when you're dealing with topics that have charged and heavy histories, how do you go about balancing the conflict between erasure and remembrance? Great question.
We've tried to balance it with education for folks and honoring that there are there's multiple perspectives in the conversation. Again, the presidents for our city are so unique, unlike others, because there were things that for us Portlanders really appreciate about the memory of President Theodore Roosevelt and the work that he did to create this international park system that is really world renowned in our city. However, to create that, there was a forceful removal of many native and urban indigenous communities from their homelands. And we need to be able to talk about the complexities of those stories. And we're now trying to open the door for that because we don't want to forget history, but we also want to figure out a way to honor the memories of those things that did happen before.
Yeah, totally in line with that. I think there's just like history is really, I guess we kind of see it like a history records, but it's from somebody's perspective. And obviously that's framed by certain privilege, certain biases. But to acknowledge that memory recalls, and we need to allow for mutual recounting, reconstruction of lived experiences. So I think for me, like that collective aspect and what Darion was saying, that acknowledging the multiple perspectives, like the multi-directional memory is really important. And also the fact that our memory changes, we might remember something a certain way, but then sometimes when we see an image of something, it might be, our memory would be like, oh, wait, my memory of it maybe is a little bit different than I remembered. And then also, things in the present change the way that we feel about things. So I guess it's thinking about memory as multi-directional as well as living. That's my 2 cents.
And Bethel, any final thoughts as we close out here?
No, I think that was really well said by both Darion and Macy, and I completely agree. I think at the end of the day, like, as a society, we're not static, and our memory and our kind of public realm shouldn't be either. And allowing our memorials to evolve and change is also part of that. That's it for me.
Well put. Thank you all. Thanks everyone for tuning in. For anyone who's watching this recording, this publication is published by Forecast Public Art, and we always offer these brilliant panels with all these wonderful panelists free of charge. And you are welcome to contribute to help make more panels happen in the future. That's in the chat. Our donation link, and yeah, go and read the Forward publication, see the great work that everyone's doing, follow these leaders, and good luck also in the work that you all are doing in your own communities. Thanks again, everyone.